Welcome to the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is composed of two semi-independent parts. But before we begin with the lymphatic system, the first instinct we think of is going to be, what is it involved with? And that's the question that we will discuss in a moment. But let's talk about the two semi-independent parts first. The first part is the lymphatic system and the what am I saying? The lymphatic vessels. And the lymphatic vessels resemble much like the blood vessels. But to be more precise, the lymphatic vessels resemble more like the veins as opposed to the arteries. So we can make a note on this and we can say the lymphatic vessels, its main purpose is a one-way system, which means that it just carries, so it's a one-way system, which means it carries the lymph from one end, the one-way system which transports lymph from the of from the lymphatic capillaries back into the venous system. And to be quite frank, okay, and I'll tell you why I use the word lymph. Okay, and lymph pertains to fluid found within the lymphatic system. Okay. But lymph is a fluid, and blood is also a fluid, but blood is found in the blood vessels, and lymph could be found in the lymphatic structures, which include the lymphatic vessels. And also this we'll come back to this in a moment. Let's go on to the lymphoid structures. The lymphoid structures is main function. So the lymphoid structures, if you look at the image on the right side, you can see the bone marrow is an example of the lymphoid structures. You can see the thymus is also an example of the lymphoid structure. You can see the spleen is an example of a lymphoid structure. You can see the lymph node is an example of a lymphoid structure. You can see in this area, and as you remember what I taught you guys, in the right lower quadrant, there is the appendix that is also a lymphoid structure as well. And your tonsils are lymphoid structures as well. So let's give a few examples that we know so far up to this point. Okay, so let's give examples. So when you think of examples of lymphoid structures, you think of what's known as first bone marrow. But to be more precise, we have to emphasize red bone marrow. It's not yellow bone marrow, it's red bone marrow. We have the thymus, we have the spleen, we have the lymph nodes, we have the, just to name a few, tonsils, we have what's called the appendix, we have what's called the Peyer's patch, just to name a few. Just to name a few. And there are more than just these. And so let's move on to the next one. And we'll come back to these later on. Okay. Now let's go into the functions. So the moment I use the word lymphatic system, the first thing you think of is defense. And you are correct. But let's talk about the first function, and then we'll approach to body defense. When you think of the lymphatic system, you think of lymphatic circulation. Now, if you recall what I taught you guys at the very beginning of class, at the very beginning of the semester, I said the circulatory system is composed of, it's a combination of both cardiovascular system and Okay, and the reason why is this is that both of these systems are involved with circulation with different volume. The cardiovascular system is involved with circulation of blood, whereas the lymphatic system is involved with circulation of the lymph. Now, let's ask number one, why do we need to have lymphatic circulation? Well, we know that with a blood circulation, you provide oxy blood to the tissues, you drain the oxy blood away from the tissues, and it's a part of the nourishment and removal of the waste away, away from the tissues. And that is essential for the survival of the tissues. But lymphatic circulation is something that a lot of people don't think much about. So we're going to discuss on this. Let's begin with the first discussion. Is what exactly is the purpose of lymphatic circulation? Okay, by the way, let's talk about the word lymph. So lymph, in essence, just means a fluid found within the lymphatic structures. So the moment any fluid that goes into the lymphatic structure is referred to as the lymph, period. Now, when you use the word lymphatic circulation, the main primary function of this, or primary objective of the circulation is to drain. So this is the function of the lymphatic circulation, is drains excess interstitial fluid from and drains excess interstitial fluid to prevent edema. That is simply the most important aspect of the lymphatic circulation. Now, as you drain, so what we can say is this, as you drain the fluid, it will be filtered by what's known as the lymphoid structures. So that takes us to the second function, is body defense. So when you think of the body defense, you think of what's known as immunity. Immunity. So when you think of immunity, it's very important to think about that because it's involved with how your body is able to fight off infection. And I also want to go back to the lymphoid structures. And what I forgot to mention is that the lymphoid structure what is it involved with is that its main function is for defense by filtering the lymph. So you think of it as in essence, you can think of it as a filtering system. So the moment the lymph goes through the lymphoid structures, the lymphoid structures collect and filter the lymph, and what comes out of the lymphoid structures will be very, very filtered lymph. And for that reason, let's use an example of this, is that when you have an infection at a local site, the nearby lymph node becomes swollen. And the reason why it becomes swollen is because it becomes hyperactive in filtering the lymph in that local region. And for that reason, the lymph node swells up because it's overactive. And once the infection is gone, the lymph node basically subside. The size of the lymph node will return back to normal. So it will subside. But in the meantime, its main purpose is to filter the lymph. All right, any question on this? So as you can see from the right, the image, you can see the bone marrow. To be more precise, we can say the red bone marrow, the thymus, the lymphatic vessels, the thoracic duct, the spleen, the lymph node. So these are examples of the structures involved with the lymphatic system. All right, write your questions down and we will come back to the questions in a moment. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And the first function of the lymphatic system is lymphatic circulation. So I mentioned in the previous slide that it's a one-way system, which means it drains the excess interstitial fluid back to the venous system. Okay, so let's examine what that means is this. I want you to look at the right image. In a nutshell, we know that when you combine both of these, this represents what's called the circulatory system. As I mentioned in the last slide, the circulatory system is involved with circulation in general, whether it's circulation of blood, or is it circulation of, so whether it's circulation of blood or lymph, or just in general, any volume, okay, in general volume, right? Now, so let's examine this image right now, the right image, and we can see, when you look at the right image right here, you can see that the heart is a pump, so we know it's a pump, right? So we know the heart is a pump, and its main purpose is it pumps the volume out into the arterial system, and the arterial system delivers blood into the organs and to provide nutrients to the organs. Now, also, this you can see the arrows moving out, which represents there's some volume leaking out of the capillaries. So there are some volume leaking out into the tissue in the capillaries. So as the nutrients are leaving, as the gas is permeating the capillaries, there are also liquid water, I can say, leaking out, okay, and due to the pressure within the blood vessels, and that pressure, beyond the scope of this class, that pressure is called hydrostatic pressure. Okay, that's beyond the scope of this class. And now, the next thing is this: is that the volume that goes back, so we are losing some volume there. So we know for a fact is this: we're losing this volume that leaks out of the capillaries. Okay. So what comes back into the veins, the blood volume that goes back into the veins. Now, do keep in mind this: blood does contain water. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so no doubt of that. Now, what we can also say is this: is that the blood that leaves the capillaries versus the blood that goes into the capillary is there's a discrepancy in volume. What goes into the capillary is higher than what leaves the capillary. So what that means is this: is that some water is lost within the tissue. So that we have to find a way to remove that water that is lost within the tissue to make sure that that water does not collect over time and result in what's called edema. And what is the exact is edema is? Edema is an excess collection of water within the interstitial space, causing you to swell up. So the tissue becomes swollen because there's excess water inside the tissue itself. Now, do keep in mind is that we do have some form of water in the tissues, yes. But when you have excess collection of water, the tissue becomes puffy, and that is known as edema. Is it normal? The answer is yes when you have to fight infection, but normally the answer is no. Okay, so edema is so during infections, edema is a form of an innate mechanisms that the body uses to dilute the pathogens. So, and also it's a form of removal of the pathogens, but normally edema is not normal. Okay. Now, let's examine the lymphatic circulation. It's a one-way system which drains excess interstitial fluid back to the venous system. Okay, so let's basically use what we see on the left image. So when you look at the image on the left side, you see values as opposed to the image on the right side. It's the same concept, but let's label a few things first. So this represents the arterial system. And this represents what's called the capillary beds. If you remember what I taught you guys in the last slide, capillaries do not exist by themselves. Rather, they exist as a collection of capillaries forming the bed. Now, and this would be the veins, venous system. Now, this venous system is, so in this image right here, it shows you it's longer than the other part, just for the sake of the this image. So, and everything goes back into the heart. That's obvious. So the heart is going to be at this end right here. So we can make a box of this, and I can draw a little box right here, and I can say everything goes back into the heart. And I can type in the word heart. And you might want to ask the questions is which part of the heart does it go back into, right? And the answer is going to be it goes back into the right atrium of the heart. But for now, we'll just use the word heart. Make it easier for you guys. And I'll make it the color red. All right. Now what I'm going to do now is this. I'm going to move this over here. So it's time consuming, but it's worth it once we're done. And you can see the bigger picture of this. It's worth very much of the time that you spend. Okay. Now, as you can see from this image right here, we have what's known as in any day that you have, any single day that you have. Okay, so let's make it more congruent on this. Okay, so let's make it more basically is the same format because when you look at the same format, because we are creatures of habits, we want to see things the same way, and so we are going to so what I'm going to do is I'll try to match this for you guys, and we're just creatures of habits, which is fine in my opinion. And so now now what we can say is that when you look at this image on the left side, you can see that there are values. Okay, so let's begin on the discussion of how volumes is being circulated throughout the arteries or throughout the arterial system and the venous system. And so objectively, what goes into the arterial system must be the same. The volume is the same. So what leaves the heart and into the arterial system should be the same as what comes back into the heart by the venous system. Okay, so that is objectively what we want to look at, correct? Okay, now before I do anything on this, I want to basically is briefly talk about the volume, the name of the volumes that we will discuss. Now, if you remember what I said is this, in any, if you remember what I said at the very beginning of this semester, I said that water is 60%, makes up 60% of your body weight. Okay? So water could be found everywhere. It could be found in the cell, inside the cells, outside the cells, which could be meaning anything. So it could be inside the interstitial space or extracellular space in general. That's what it means. Water outside the cells. Now, the way you name the fluid is based on location. So for example, okay, intracellular fluid. What does that mean? It's within the cells. Good. Interstitial fluid. What does that mean? Good. So it's not the cells, it must be the tissues. But to be more precise, we can say water in between cells of tissues, right? Good. Okay. We can also say what's called the lymph. What does that mean? Water, or let's use the word fluid in the lymphatic structure, or blood. What is this? That would be fluid in blood vessel. Okay, good. So, but simply this fluid contains water. Okay, now the composition may be different somewhat to a certain extent, but it does contain water. And if you look at the color of the fluid, it varies, it differs. Blood is red, lymph is somewhat milky, water is clear. Well, hopefully it should be clear, right? And the composition is relatively different based on what's in the fluid, but that can be discussed at a different time. But now let's return to this. Okay. So in any one day, we have about what's known as 7,200 liters of blood going into the blood vessels, the arterial system. Now, of that 7,200 liters of blood going into the arterial system, there is 20 liters of water leaking out of the capillary. Okay, so we can say 20 liters of water. I'll use H2O. You should know what H2O stands for, right? Yes, you should. We mentioned this on the first during the chemistry section of this class. So you should know what H2O is. And you hear the word H2O quite a bit. H2O means water. So you have 20 liters of water leaking out. Well, the question you want to ask is this: why can't we use the word blood? The reason behind it is that the blood is contains RBC among other cells, and the RBCs are just too big to be leaked out. So for that reason, the water is being pushed out due to the pressure called hydrostatic pressure. And this is beyond the scope, but I'm going to basically tell you guys the pressure is called by hydrostatic pressure. That's beyond, that's FYI, the pressure itself. Okay. Now, of that 20 liters of water leaking out, it's being pushed out to be more precise. So the water so the pressure into the blood vessel, the hydrostatic pressure in the blood vessel pushes the water, 20 liters of water out of the capillary. Now, there's an opposing force called osmotic pressure produced by the albumins. So the albumins help to reclaim back the 20 liter of water, not the 20 liter, the 17 liter of water back. So we can say reclaim by the osmotic pressure produced by albumin. So if you remember what I taught you in the blood lecture, I taught you, I said this, exactly this is what I said. I said the albumin is the most abundant type of protein in the blood. Albumin produces what's known as the osmotic pressure. So what that means is this: the osmotic pressure, what it does is that it pulls back the water from the interstitial space, and the blue part right here represents what's called interstitial space. anything that is inside the space is called interstitial fluid. So so if you have 20 liter leaking out and you only reclaim back 17, that means there's a net loss of 3 liters. So we can say net loss of 3 liters. So this 3 liter now is known as so the 3 liter that we have now is known as the interstitial fluid. Okay, so just keep in mind this interstitial fluid is the one that is the one that causes, when you have an excess of this fluid, it causes what's called edema. And when you have edema, it swells up. That's what it means. So the 3 liter of volume that we have based on this image must be brought back into the venous system. So the same volume that leaves the heart will come back into the heart. Okay. So that's our objective and we can we can type in the little objective is that we can say volume, blood volume leaving the heart to enter the arterial system must be equal to a certain extent to the blood volume returning back into, I'll just zoom in. Well, I'll zoom out. Ooh, I can't zoom out because I can't see that. Okay, which is okay. We can basically this is the easy part that we can do right here. Okay, we can just basically add this right here. So I'll continue on with this. You know, when you're so into the typing, you just forget that there are limitations in space, and which is okay. We can always improvise, and that's the beauty of okay. We can say the blood volume leaving the heart to enter the arterial system must be equal to the blood volume returning back into the heart by the venous system. So this is a statement I want you guys to focus on. Okay. So what it says right now is this. It says that the blood volume leaving the heart to enter the arterial system must be equal to the blood volume returning back into the heart by the venous system. Okay. All right. So perfect. Okay. Perfect. So this is basically this. The take home message is this. Take home message. And what that means is this is that the volume so it's a closed circuit. So think of the cardiovascular system is a closed circuit, which means that what goes around must come back. Okay, the same volume must come back. Now, assuming there's no hemorrhaging, right? Okay, there's no bleeding, internal bleeding of any sort. Okay, that's the assumption. So if you so let's talk about how is it possible. So the lymphatic circulation is the primary mechanism is used to maintain this volume as it goes back into the vein. Okay, so we can see right here it says lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is that the lymphatic system is going to have what's called lymphatic circulation. The lymphatic system is involved with lymphatic circulation in which the excess interstitial fluid is drained back into the vein before it goes back into the heart. So let's use this this image right here. And before I move on to anything is this. So let's begin again. I know it's taking a lot of time, but I just want you to have a full, complete understanding of this. Okay. So let's begin with the blood vessels. Okay. In one day, you have 7,200 liters of volume moving across the arterial system. Of that 7,200 liter of blood per day moving across the arterial system, it will enter, the same volume enters the capillary bed. So what enters the capillary bed is going to be known as 7,200 liter of volume going into the capillary bed. Now, of that 7,200 liter of volume going into the capillary bed, 20 liter leaks out. And the 20 liter is leaking out, and the reason why it's leaking out is because what's known as the hydrostatic pressure is the one that causes it to leak out. Okay. So the hydrostatic pressure is the one that will cause it to leak out. And what that means is that this pressure itself pushes the water out of the capillary and into what's known as the interstitial space. Now, inside the capillary, you have what's called albumin, and the albumin itself produces what's called osmotic pressure, which help to reclaim back the 17 liter of water. Okay, so it's not a whole 20 liter of water that is being lost. You only reclaim 17 of the 20 liter of water. So which means there's a net loss of 3 liter of water stuck outside or stuck within the interstitial space. And now that 3 liter of volume of water contributes to what's known as the interstitial fluid. Now, when you have excess contribution or a collection of water, that will produce what's called edema. So edema just means, the word edema just means excess collection. So excess collection of, so edema just means swelling caused by collection. So edema just means swelling caused by excess collection of, caused by excess collection of interstitial fluid within the interstitial space. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is what edema is. It's swelling caused by excess collection of interstitial fluid within the interstitial space. Now, if you notice that we normally don't have edema, and the reason why is that as this occurs, you know, our body would try to resolve this by moving that volume. So this happens, over the day. So within the day, it always happens within the day. So that, but we give it as a total amount in one day. So our lymphatic system is always moving the excess volume from the interstitial space back into the venous system. So we can enter right here. It says, so 7,200 liter of blood going into the arterial system, and the same volume goes into the capillaries. By the time the blood leaves the capillary, there's only 7,000. I'll make it bigger so I can emphasize on this. 197 liter of 197 liter. Okay, so that means that if you notice that there's a loss of what? There's a loss of 3 liter of volume. Okay, now, so we know the 3 liter is sucked outside within the interstitial space. So by the time it goes back into, by the time it goes into the veins, it goes through the veins, it goes, along the venous system, you're still missing the 7,100, you're still missing the 3 liter of volume. So you still have 7,197 liter of volume moving across the venous system. You still have 7,197 liter of volume moving across the venous system. Okay. Now, so that 3 liter is being moved, it's being circulated throughout the lymphatic system. And so we have to find a way to bring that volume back into the, the venous system. Okay. Now, when you combine both of these, 7,197 combined with 3 liter, you have a total of 7,200 liter of volume going back into your heart. Okay, so keep in mind is that what goes out of the heart must come back to the heart. It's a closed circuit, which means that there is no loss of any volume, assuming we are not losing any, we're not losing any blood through bleeding. Okay, so bleeding, internal bleeding can be, can be a cause of blood loss, but normally, if there's no blood loss, if there's no bleeding, that means that what leaves the arterial system, typically the same volume goes back into the venous system. Okay. And if you do have some loss of volume, it's not by much, it's not extensive. So the loss of volume could be used to make sweat. So, for example, just when you on a hot day, you sweat a lot, and so the water from the blood could be extracted from, so could be extracted into um, the sweat gland to make sweat. Okay? And that's the reason why when you sweat a lot, you have to drink the water to replenish what you're losing. And we know is this in the sweat you have sodium as well. So water, drinking water by itself does not really replenish what you're losing because you're also losing sodium. But that would be something beyond the scope of this topic. All right, so in a nutshell, we can say the lymphatic circulation is composed of lymphatic vessels. So so, so if you understand the left image, let's go back into the right images. Okay? So you can see that we can see the objective of what the purpose of the lymphatic circulation is involved. But we need to give credit to the pathway in which the lymph moves so it can deliver the water back into the venous system. Okay? So the lymphatic circulation, the pathway is going to be, so this is a pathway of the lymphatic circulation. All right, so we can say is that interstitial fluid goes into the lymphatic capillary. I'm gonna make it smaller so you guys can see this. And the lymphatic capillary, from the lymphatic capillary, it goes into what's known as the afferent lymphatic collecting vessels. I'll just use one. There's more than one. Okay. And from there on, it goes into what's known as the lymph node. So we know for a fact is this, and there's more than one lymph node. That's obvious. But I'll just use one. I'll keep everything consistent in singular form. And the lymph node goes out into what's called the efferent lymphatic collecting vessel. So afferent means going in, efferent means coming out. Okay. And as you remember what I taught you in the last slide, the purpose of the lymph node is to filter, right? So what the lymph that comes out of the lymph node is more filter than what went into the lymph node. Now, what comes next is going to be the lymphatic trunk. And what comes next will be the lymphatic ducts. And the ducts returns the water back into the venous system, which is the vein. Okay. So this is the pathway of that. Now, the question you want to ask is this, is that where exactly is the lymph begin and where exactly does it end? Because we know lymph contains water, okay? And the water is coming from the blood, the blood. So the water as leaked out of the blood vessel contribute to the interstitial fluid, and and then the lymphatic capillary takes in that excess water within the interstitial space, and once it goes into the lymphatic capillary, the interstitial fluid becomes the lymph. So the way you name the water is based on its location. Any question on this? So I want you to think of the question, and then you can write down your questions, and then ask me other questions in the Q&A. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So I mentioned the word lymphatic vessels, and I did tell you guys the different type of lymphatic vessels. But before I repeat that, I want to make a little note on this. Lymphatic vessel is function-wise involved in transport lymph. So it's used to transport lymph within the or along the lymphatic pathways. All right. Now, feature-wise, features of the lymphatic vessels are they resemble very much like a vein. Okay? So first, they are convergent in arrangement. What that means is this: is that lymphatic vessels, smaller lymphatic vessels, merge to form larger lymphatic vessels. In addition to being convergent, we can say the pressure in the lymphatic vessel is very low. Similar to the veins. And for that reason, it requires the presence of a valve to prevent backward flow. So keep in mind this, all vessels, whether it's lymphatic or blood vessels, the main objective is to move the volume unidirectional flow. That means in one direction. It can't go backward. Um, so the valves is one of the main ways to prevent volume from going backward. So also this is that it contains the vessels typically contain three, well, with exceptions, right? With exceptions. So typically the vessels contain similar tunica as found in the veins. So if you remember what I taught you guys, okay, if you remember what I taught you guys, and I said that the tunica in the veins are tunica externa, tunica media, and tunica interna. Not all veins have tunica media. And so we know for a fact is this smaller lymphatic vessels do not have all three layers as well. And we know for a fact is this lymphatic capillary only contains the tunica interna. And the reason why is this, it has the same structural arrangement or design as the blood capillary. So in a nutshell, unknown caller. So in a nutshell, they have the same arrangement in a nutshell. Now, let's talk about the neurovascular bundle. So we're done with the lymphatic vessels. And if you want, I can basically show you the pathway in which the lymph follows in the lymphatic vessels. So these are the lymphatic vessels that that I can talk about. So when you look at the lymphatic vessels, you have what's known as, so let me show you on here is this. Okay, so let me show you first. It begins with the lymphatic capillary. It goes in, it merge and become what's called afferent lymphatic collecting vessels. Now this goes into what's known as the lymph node, so that we won't count it as a part of the vessels. And it comes back as the efferent lymphatic collecting vessel, which then drains into what's called lymphatic trunk, which drains into, oops, what happened? Which drains into what's called the lymphatic duct. And so let's go with, let's refer to the right image right here. You can see that everything begins with the lymph. So I'm gonna zoom in for you guys, okay? So everything begins with what's known as the lymphatic capillary. So I'm gonna zoom in. And from the lymphatic capillary, it goes into what's called the afferent. So this would be the afferent lymphatic collecting vessels, which drains into, and you can actually see the valves right here. So you can see the valves, small little valves, and which drains into what's known as these lymph nodes, okay, these tiny lymph nodes that we have. And the efferent collecting vessels, efferent lymphatic collecting vessels drain out of the lymph node, and they carry everything back into what's called the lymphatic trunk, which is bigger. So you can see the merging of all these lymphatic vessels or collecting vessels will form into what's called a trunk, and the lymphatic trunk would merge and form what's called the lymphatic duct, and the lymphatic duct will return the water, the volume, back into the vein. And what goes back into the heart should be the same volume as what leaves the heart for the most part. So that's if you understand that, that covers the majority of the of what the lymphatic circulation is involved with. Now let's go into what's called the neurovascular bundle. And what does it mean when it's this neurovascular bundle? Well, so typically, what we can say is this, is that typically blood vessels travel along with nerve and lymphatic vessels. Oops, why does it do this? I don't know why it does this. So, which is not a good thing. So let's go to the next page. And we're gonna go back to the word nerves. All right. And when they travel together as so forming a bundle referred to as neurovascular bundle. So when you look at the image on the right side, you can see that they travel together as one bundle, and it's going to be what's called neurovascular bundle. The green one is the lymphatic vessel. The yellow one is nerve, and the blue and the red are blood vessels. Okay, so we said blood vessels travel with the nerves and the lymphatic vessels, forming a bundle referred to as neurovascular bundles. Okay? So we should use the word bundles, right? So anyway, so that's not important. So in any case, let's move on. Okay. All right, let's begin with lymphoid structures. Okay. The lymphoid structures, as I mentioned, is basically our lymphatic structures. So the lymphoid structures, so you can interchangeably use them, lymphatic or lymphoid structures, but let's use the word lymphoid structures. So the lymphoid structures can be subdivided into primary and secondary lymphoid structures. Now, as I say this, you are probably thinking, why? What is the distinction of separation between the lymphoid structures? Well, there has to be a reason in the sense of there's a functional reason. So when you think of the lymphatic system, the major um, type of white blood cell that you want to think of is going to be the lymphocytes. The lymphocyte is the major type of white blood cells involved with the lymphatic system. So we can say is that the lymphoid structures can be divided into the primary and secondary lymphoid structures. And now what does that mean? And what it means is this, is that the primary lymphoid structures represent are the sites where the lymphocytes are produced from and where they undergo, where the lymphocytes are produced from. So let's go. And produced from, and where they mature to become. So let's represent the sites where the lymphocytes are produced from, and also where these lymphocytes undergo maturation to become immunocompetent. So, so the two structures that make up the primary lymphoid structures are bone marrow and thymus. So the bone marrow, let's examine the image. But the bone marrow, to be more precise, it is a red bone marrow. And this is the bone marrow represents the site. And by the way, the red bone marrow is found in the spongy bone, The bone marrow represents the site where the lymphocytes, the B and the T lymphocytes are produced. Now, in addition to this, the B lymphocytes I'm gonna basically move it a bit to the right side, and I'll change color for you guys so you guys would know that there's a distinction between this and the previous statement. Okay, and the what we can also say is this is that we can say and you know what? I'm gonna move this over here because I think there's no point of mentioning this. Okay, I can move it over here, and I have to be creative on this. I have to be creative on this. Just make sure, and you guys already know the red bone marrows and the spongy bones, right? Yes, of course you do. This is from the exam 3. Okay, now, so the bone marrow is a site where lymphocytes, the B and the T cells, so when I use the word lymphocyte, it includes the B and the T lymphocytes are produced from. The B lymphocytes remain within the bone marrow to undergo maturation, so to become immunocompetent, while the T lymphocytes migrate into the thymus to become or to undergo maturation to become immunocompetent. So what that means is the thymus represent the site. They'll represent the site where the T lymphocytes undergo maturation to become immunocompetent. So now, this is what we wanted to understand is this. The primary lymphoid structures represent the sites where the lymphocytes are produced from. And when I say lymphocytes, that means the B and the T lymphocytes are produced within the bone marrow. Now, the primary lymphoid structures also represent the sites where the lymphocytes undergo maturation to become immunocompetent. So once the B cells or B lymphocytes are produced, they remain within the bone marrow to undergo maturation, while the T lymphocytes migrate into the thymus to undergo maturation. So if you look at the image right here, you can see that the bone marrow is a site where the B and the T lymphocytes are produced at. Now the B lymphocytes remain within the bone marrow to undergo maturation. And the T lymphocyte migrates into the thymus to undergo maturation. So the T lymphocyte mature in the thymus. So this is a thymus right here. So I'm going to type in the word thymus. So I'm going to type in the word thymus for you to indicate that in the thymus you have the thymus. Okay. So I'll use darker. Okay, good. Okay, so I can say thymus is going to be the thymus, and I can put underneath that, I can say T site where, I'll make it smaller, and I'll use a different color for it to stand out. The site where the T cells undergo maturation. And actually red does not fit well. Let's use black. Okay, I think that works pretty well. Okay, so now, so we're done with that. The second statement I want to make is this. The second statement I want to make is going to be on the left side, I'm going to make a bold statement. Once both lymphocytes are immunocompetent, they migrate. Let's use what they leave the primary lymphoid structures to migrate into the secondary lymphoid structure. So you can see in the image on the right side is that the T cells leaving the thymus to go into the what's known as the lymph node, and the B cells leaving the bone marrow to go into the lymph node. Okay. So secondary lymphoid structures represent represent the site. So secondary lymphoid structures represent the site. So these represent, I'll make it bigger, a bit bigger, represent the sites where mature lymphocytes, smaller, a bit smaller, where mature lymphocytes take refuge in order to monitor and protect the body from foreign pathogens or infectious agents. So what we know for a fact is that the secondary lymphoid structures are the one that is involved with your immunity. So once the lymphocytes are produced, once the lymphocytes are mature, are produced and mature from the primary lymphoid structures, these mature primary lymphoid structures migrate into the secondary lymphoid structures, and they take refuge, or they reside within the secondary lymphoid structures, and they stay there, and they begin to monitor the body and protect the body from foreign pathogens and infectious agents. So now let's ask the question is what are examples of secondary lymphoid structures? And the simple answer is spleen, lymph nodes, and lymphatic nodules. So when you ask the questions is that what is the difference between the lymph nodes and spleen versus lymphatic nodules? Well, we know for a fact is lymph node is so it's defined by definition is an encapsulated lymphatic organ. The spleen, so we have pretty much is this, we have superficial lymph nodes, we have deep lymph nodes. And so what we can say is that we can say there are superficial lymph nodes. So there are different types of lymph nodes. We have what's called superficial lymph node. So lymph nodes accompany organs. Okay, so what it means is it's not, to be more precise, is that lymph nodes are very scattered, meaning that you have groups of lymph nodes and so on. So they're very scattered. And the purpose of being scattered is so they can filter more of the lymph. But the superficial lymph nodes group together in various locations. So we have so the superficial lymph nodes. So there are 3 sites where there are large masses of lymph nodes, and they are going to be known as cervical region. So these are the regions. Okay, so we can use the word cervical lymph nodes, which means it's along the neck, and we can say axillary lymph nodes, which can be found in. So this is a group of lymph nodes found with along the armpits, and we can say inguinal lymph nodes, which means a group of superficial lymph nodes found along the inguinal region. Now, if you have superficial lymph nodes, you must have what's known as the deep lymph nodes. All right. Okay. Now the spleen. So if you ask the question, is where can you find the lymph nodes? They're everywhere. I mean, pretty much they are everywhere. They're very abundant. Okay, and the purpose of that is so it helps to protect our body against infections. Okay? Now the spleen is an easier. We can easily trace the spleen, and the reason why we know is it can be found in the left upper quadrant. So I mentioned this on the first day of class, left upper quadrant. Now, we know for a fact, and this is a fact, a spleen is an organ. So it's an encapsulated lymphatic organ. Organ, not organs. Now, lymphatic nodules, okay, we can say these are non-encapsulated masses of lymphatic tissues. So what means is this, the nodules in essence are lymphatic tissues. So they're just mass of lymphatic tissues, and a lot of time they are found within the mucosa. And so when I use the word lymphatic nodule versus lymph nodes, they are not the same. One is an organ, one is a tissue. So keep in mind this. So this right here that you see represent what's known as a lymph node, and we know the lymph node is an organ. So the mature B and T lymphocytes migrate into the lymph node and they stay in the lymph node to offer protection. So we know the lymph node is involved with filtering the lymph. So when you have an infection in a certain region, for example, let's say you have an infection somewhere in the inguinal region. Okay, so let's use an example, STD. So once you have the infection in the inguinal region, what will happen is that the inguinal lymph nodes become swollen. And the reason why it becomes swollen is because the lymph node becomes overactive or hyperactive, which means they overwork, and for that reason they swell up, and as they are overworked, and they help to resolve the infection. Now, once the infection is resolved, the lymph node, the size of the lymph node, the swelling will subside, and the lymph node returns back to normal. Now, so let's move on to the next one. So any question is, if you have questions, write it down, write those questions down, and ask me during the Q&A session. Moving on to the thymus. What exactly is the thymus? Okay. If you look at this image, the image on the right side, you can see in this image right here, we can see the thymus is going to be inferior to the thyroid gland and superior to the heart. So it's a bilobe organ, so which means it has two lobes. We have one lobe here and two lobes on the side. So 1 and 2. Okay, so two lobes, 1, 1. So we can say 1, 1. So I can't say 2, right? So when you 1 plus 1 is 2, right? Okay, so you have two lobes, 1 plus 1 will be 2. Now, this organ is very active during childhood. And the reason why it's active during childhood is because the organ, so thymus is active during childhood. And the reason why is because the T lymphocytes must undergo maturation to become immunocompetent. So during childhood is when where you are forming immunity, and hopefully that by the time you reach adulthood, your immune system is fully developed and so on. Okay? So this is the reason why it's active during childhood. Now, what it also says is that the organ, the thymus, slowly undergoes atrophy. So the word atrophy means shrinkage in size. Shrinkage in size. That's what it means. And I mentioned this many weeks ago. After adolescence, and it's replaced by fatty tissue. So what we can say is this, what we can make a note is this: the thymus of the baby is larger, of an infant, let's use that, an infant is larger than the thymus of an adult. The answer is true. Okay. So as you get with age, not with age, but after adolescence, what will happen is the thymus. So I don't know what happened. I apologize for that. So after adolescence, the thymus will be replaced by fatty tissues. Okay, moving on. So once again, is the thymus gland is a part of what's known as it's an example of primary lymphoid structure, where and function-wise, it's a site where the T lymphocytes undergo maturation to become immunocompetent. Very good. Let's move on to the next one. So any question, write down your question, and we will come back to the question later on. So I will just make it this different color so it will stand out for you guys. Okay, moving on. Spleen. The spleen can be found at the level of the ribs 9 through 12. And to be more precise, also we can say is this also at the, so we can make it bigger. And also at the, in the left upper quadrant. Okay. So now once again once again we can say the spleen is, so we can say the spleen is an encapsulated organ found in the left upper quadrant. And the functions of the spleen are removal and destruction of ORBC. So if you recall what I said, in the spleen, the macrophage in the spleen, the macrophage is a type of white blood cell, and spleen is involved with the breakdown of old RBCs. So the macrophage in the spleen are involved with the macrophages in the spleen are involved with the breakdown of ORBCs. The spleen is involved with storage of platelets and white blood cells. So they store platelets and white blood cells. And the spleen also initiates the immune response. So the question that we can ask is this, is that what would happen if, okay, so the question we want to ask is this, is that what would happen if there's no spleen? So let's say in the case of, so the question we can say is this, what would happen in the case of, what would happen to the person if in the case of splenectomy? And splenectomy just means removal of the spleen. Okay. Well, this is a good question to ask, and there's so we want to address this, and I'll address this in a different. I'm going to move this because I need more space. So the question we're going to ask is what would happen to the person in the case of splenectomy? And the simple answer is going to be, well, first and foremost, the liver takes over the function of the removal and destruction of old RBCs. Okay. Next thing is this, we can say also, and other lymphatic or lymphoid structures participate or pitch in the immune response. But here's the next thing is this, but only the spleen can destroy bacteria with a capsule, and for such as pneumococcus. This is beyond the scope of this class, which is a bacteria. And so in this case, so which means so people who have no spleen is required to get vaccinated against pneumococcus. It is always advised, especially with people, older patients, to get their um, um, get vaccinated against pneumococcus. So it's called pneumovac. And what that means is that it protects them against pneumococcus, which causes pneumonia. But people who have no spleen, regardless of their age, need to be vaccinated against pneumococcus. All right, very good. Any question on this? I'm going to zoom out. And you can see the spleen is, in this case, and I forgot to show you this, in this image right here, you can see the spleen is in the left upper quadrant. Okay. And to be more precise, we can say is this, the spleen is, we can say, also to describe this is, we can say the spleen, we can say the spleen is lateral to the tail of the pancreas. And this statement is to be discussed later on. And you can actually see is that behind the stomach, you have what's known as the pancreas, and the pancreas has a tail, and the tail of the pancreas is going to be medial to the spleen. All right, let's move to tonsils. Okay, so tonsils are not organs. Okay, so tonsils are rather known as lymphatic nodules. And the purpose of tonsils is to trap and remove bacteria and foreign materials. So they do assist in the immune response. But let's ask the question: is that where can you find tonsils? Tonsils are found within the pharynx. And there are four different tonsils. Four different tonsils. Okay. So let's talk about first one is this. Okay. And by the way, we can say is the pharynx. So we have four different tonsils. Then the pharynx can be subdivided, and the pharynx subdivides into what's known as nasopharynx, which connects with the nose, oropharynx, which connects with the mouth, and laryngopharynx, which connects with the larynx and the esophagus. Okay. So let me give you a brief breakdown of the pharynx. So the pharynx is known as your throat. So the pharynx subdivides. So the pharynx subdivides into three regions. And the three regions are known as nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So let's begin with this right here. And let me show you on this image right here. You can see this is the nose. This is the nose, the nasal cavity right here. So I'm going to type in nasal cavity of the nose. Nasal cavity. And this would be the mouth. All right, that's obvious. Okay. And the palate separates the nasal cavity from the mouth. Okay. And let's use the word oral cavity, because now we're a bit more advanced on the terminology, so that let's use a different term. Okay, it shows how advanced we are. So oral cavity. So let's begin with the different type of the different regions of the pharynx. So the nasopharynx is the top part right here. The nasopharynx connects with what's known as the nasal cavity. That makes sense. Nasopharynx connects with the nasal cavity. Good. The oropharynx is right here, which connects with what's known as the oral cavity. Good. The next one's going to be what's called the laryngopharynx. Is right there. Connects with what's known as the larynx. So I'll put L for larynx. So right here, L represent larynx. And E represent esophagus. So I am going to type in L here and E next to it. So we can say that the esophagus is behind the trachea, which is a continuation, and also behind the larynx as well. And the trachea is a continuation to the larynx. Now keep in mind this, the larynx is a part of the airway, and the esophagus is a part of your food passage. Or digestive tract, if you want to use that. For now, we'll just use the word food passage. Or let's use the word digestive tract. All right, or food passage. I'm so indecisive, but I just want you to understand this, since we haven't done the digestive system, so you might be confused on this. So now let's go back to what we have, the four different tonsils. So the four different tonsils that we have are going to be known as, the first one is going to be known as So the first tonsil we have is going to be known as, all right, we have what's called pharyngeal tonsil. You know what? I'm going to move it down here because I need more space than just this. So I will move down to here and I'm going to type in 4 different tonsils. Number 1, pharyngeal tonsil. So it's just a patch of lymphatic tissues, and this is often referred to as adenoids. Now, this could be found in the nasal pharynx. So along the back wall of the nasal pharynx, as you can see from this image right here, this is the pharyngeal tonsil, which could be found along the back wall of the nasal pharynx. Number two is going to be known as the tubal tonsils. These are going to be tonsils found around the opening into the eustachian tube found in the nasal pharynx. Okay. Now, first, what is a eustachian tube? That's the question that you want to ask. What is a eustachian tube? So a eustachian tube, so let me make a note on the right side. So you can actually see where it says opening to the eustachian tube or auditory tube. Okay, opening to the eustachian tube or auditory tube. Okay. Now let me just tell you what that means is this. Why did I use the word eustachian tube and not auditory tube? The eustachian tube is basically an older term that a lot of people are acquainted to using. The eustachian tube, also known as auditory tube. What it is a tube that connects between the middle ear, and the nasal pharynx. Okay, so it's a tube that connects between the middle ear and the nasal pharynx. And for that and the reason why, and this is what you can think of in this case is that when you have a throat infection, so the infection in the pharynx, there is a chance that you could get an ear infection. And the reason why is there's a connection between the throat, in this case we will use the word nasopharynx, and the middle ear by what's called eustachian tube. So the bacteria can easily move within the tube itself, the eustachian tube, to go into the ear from the throat. And this is very common, especially in babies. Once babies get throat infections, they get ear infections, and that's very common. And now, you can ask me why in the Q&A, but let's move on. And the next thing is this: what is exactly is the function of this eustachian tube? Okay, why do we need it? So it could cause problems. Okay, and the function of this tube is to equalize the pressure between the middle ear and the outer ear to ensure that the eardrum can vibrate. If the pressure within the middle ear is higher than the outer ear, you can hear that you can feel that your ear is muffled, so you can't hear anything. So for that reason, they always tell you this: as you're coming down, as the airplane is descending up and about to land, you always want to chew gum, or basically it's just chew gum in general, or swallow. Because when you swallow, what happens is that the eustachian tube opens, and that allows the pressure between the outer ear and the middle ear to be equalized, which allows the eardrum to vibrate. So it resolves the sound from being muffled, so you can hear things. So, all right. So now, so we're done with the eustachian tube. So you at the opening of the eustachian tube in the nasopharynx, you have what's called tubal tonsils. So these tonsils around the eustachian tube, the opening of the eustachian tube, help to protect the infection from going into the eustachian tube and up into the middle ear. Now, the third type of tonsil is going to be known as palatine tonsil. Okay. And this could be found in the oral pharynx. Okay. So the palatine tonsils are, you can see from this image right here, is that on the left image is that these are the palatine tonsils right here. This is the uvula in the middle. This piece of this is the uvula. On the two sides are going to be known as the palatine tonsils. Oh, contain the palatine tonsils, I should say. Now, the palatine tonsils, when they swell up, you can actually see it. So when you open your mouth, and they said, when you can feel it in your mouth, and when you open, they can expect the palatine tonsils to be swollen. And so so often is that when they remove the tonsils, so when you ask the questions is, who have had their tonsils removed? And people raise their hand. And typically the one that is removed is what's known as the palatine tonsil. Now, the reason why it is removed is because when it's swollen, what happens is that you can't eat. And if you can't eat, what happens, and you have a hard time breathing as well. But you can breathe with your nose, right? And that's fine. But if you can't eat, what happens is you'll be malnourished. And the thing is when you're sick, you want to eat to make sure that you get all the nutrients so you can recover quicker. But if you can't eat, well, what happens is you become malnourished, which means your immune system will be weaker. And so that defeats the whole purpose of having this tonsil. So to make it easier, they remove it. And that's now the question that people often ask is that if I remove my palatine tonsil, what would happen? Well, the simple answer is that the body itself will compensate. So which means um, other lymphatic organs or lymphoid structures, other lymphoid structures will pitch in and help with the immune response. And keep in mind this, in your mouth, you have what's known as um, saliva, which is also one of the forms that will help to, um, protect against infections. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that you should lick dirt and so on, but it's just it's one way of protection, right? So let's move on to the next one. Is going to be, um, and the last one is going to be what's known as lingual tonsil. So the word lingual means tongue. So this tonsil could be found at the base of the tongue in the oral pharynx. So we know this is how strategic these tonsils are. The tonsils are found at the near to the two entry point into your body. So what happens is, so first and foremost is this, if the infectious agent managed to go into your nose or past the hair in your nose and it goes into the nasal cavity, it will proceed onto the nasopharynx. At the nasopharynx, you have protection by the pharyngeal tonsils and the tubal tonsils. Okay, so these are how strategic these tonsils are found at. Now, the next opening that we have is called a mouth, the opening of the mouth. If infectious agent managed to bypass or go into the mouth and go back all the way into the pharynx, well, before it can enter the oral pharynx, you have what's known as the palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils. They are used to guard the infectious agent from moving onward. So the location of these tonsils are very strategic, which is amazing in my opinion. It's just that all the organs in the body, they are found in their respective location, and it's very strategic. It has a function, so it's very efficient in terms of their performance. And you can see the appreciation I have of the structures of the human body, because why? When you think of this, the appreciation, you think of functions, how it keep you in homeostasis, how these organs keep you being maintain your health. And so that's the reason why I think appreciation of these organs does improve your um, your ability, or does help for you to think about taking care of your body, so it can take so these organs can take care of your health and prolong your lifespan. So keep in mind this is that our body is a shrine. What we put into it will help to preserve our lifespan. So the longer you, the better you take, the well care that you take care of your body, the longer you are gonna live for the most part. Okay? Now, so we're done with the lymphatic structures. Let's move into what's called the immune system. Okay? So let's move on to the next page. The immune system. So if you recall what I said on the first day, the immune system is not on the list of the 11 organ systems. And the reason why is the immune system is a subset of the lymphatic system. So often in anatomy, you study the lymphatic system, and in physiology, you study the immune system. Okay, that's just how it works. So when you think of the immune system, you examine the functional aspect of the lymphatic system. Now, if you remember what I said on the first day, function and structure go hand in hand. You can't have the function unless you have the structure, right? And so they go hand in hand. So when you think of the lymphatic system, you think of the structures. When you think of the immune system, you think of the functions involved in keeping you healthy. Okay, now, when I use the word immunity, what does it mean when I use the word immunity? And people often say, I'm immune to everything. What does it mean when I use the word immunity? So what that means is this. So here's an example during this time right now is this, during the COVID-19 pandemic. So coronavirus basically is the COVID-19. Let's talk about COVID-19. So the reason why the COVID-19 is very dangerous is because they use the word novel virus. Novel means it's new. So the COVID-19 is brand new. That means that we have not encountered the COVID-19, our immune system, to be quite frank. We have never been exposed to COVID-19. And for that reason, our immune system does not know how to respond to it. And for that reason, the COVID-19 can have an adverse impact on our respiratory system. But let's talk about immunity. What does it mean when I use the word immunity? The word immunity just means the, oops, oh, what happened? Okay. The word immunity just means the ability to ward off infectious agents. Infectious agents. Good. Okay. Now, there are two types of immunity. So there are two types of immunity. So we can say is that there are two types of immunity, and they are going to be known as innate. Okay. All right. And versus what's known as, or versus known as acquire or adaptive immunity. So you have innate immunity and acquired or adaptive immunity. So innate immunity is non-specific. So innate immunity is involved with non-specific mechanisms of defense against pathogens. An example of innate defense represent what's called the surface barriers, such as your skin and mucosa. If you recall that on the first day of class, I asked this question, your skin is the first line of defense, yes or no? The answer is yes. That means that once your skin is present, the infectious agent can't cause any harm to your body unless they breach the skin. So when you have a cut, it's very crucial that you take care of the cut is because the cut represents the breach in your skin in which the infectious agent can enter and cause havoc. Okay. Now, and it's not specific. And the second example of innate defense would be internal defense, such as it's involved with phagocytes. If you recall what I said, there are two examples of phagocytes. Yes, the first phagocyte is going to be known as, so give me an example of phagocytes that you can think of. The two examples of phagocytes make me proud. Good. Neutrophils. Very good. What is the second type of example of phagocytes? Very good. Macrophage. So often people ask the question, why not monocytes? Why macrophage? Well, monocyte is also the same thing as macrophage, except monocyte and macrophage are found in different locations. Yes or no? The second example of internal defense is natural killer cells, which means they kill off everything. Inflammation is also an example of internal defense, of innate defense. Antimicrobial proteins are found in your saliva, so which help to fight off pathogens. Now, of course, I'm not advocating for you to basically eat dirt and so on, but your saliva has what's called antimicrobial proteins. And fever also is a way to help to fight off infections, but prolonged high-grade fever can do damage to your neurons. And so what it says is this, is that fever helps to fight off infection. And the reason why fever fight off infection is because the high temperature help to denature the proteins, and which means if the proteins are denatured, that means it becomes non-functional. So we can say this innate immunity is involved with non-specific mechanisms of defense against pathogens. So we can say involved with non-specific mechanisms of defense against pathogens. Also, innate immunity is present at birth. It's present at birth. Okay. Now, let's go to the next one. Is this acquired immunity? That's the second type of immunity in this case. Now, it's also known as AKA it's also known as adaptive immunity. And now this type of immunity is involved with specific mechanisms of defense. And what it means is that it's involved with humoral immunity, which is involved with the B cells and the cellular immunity is involved with T cells. All right, so let's examine the humoral immunity in this case. So when you look at this, the top and this image right here on the right side, the right bottom image you can see is the top one is going to be known as the top one is going to be known as cellular immunity. And when you look at the cellular immunity, you can see the T lymphocytes. So let's examine the T lymphocytes. So in this cellular immunity, you can see the T lymphocytes, they are going, so let me just zoom in for you guys to see it because it's crucial that you see it. So it binds to target cells and secrete the protein, and this protein will cause or produce holes inside the target cells. Okay. So what will happen is that it actually punch holes in the target cells, which are infectious agent. So once you punch hole into the target cells will die, and that's how the T lymphocytes are going to be involved with fighting pathogens. So we can say in this case, we can say the cellular immunity is going to be a direct destruction of the pathogens by the T lymphocytes. And that makes sense because why? The T lymphocytes in this case will bind to the T lymphocytes will bind to the target cells, and what will happen is that it will attack the target cells and cause the target cells to die. Now let's go on to the bottom image and we see the B lymphocytes. So in this case, it's going to be known as what's known as humoral immunity. So in humoral immunity, it is going to be involved with the B lymphocyte. So let me just explain first to you what is involved here. Okay. So in this image that we see here, the B lymphocytes once the B lymphocyte encounters the pathogen, it differentiates into what's called plasma cells. And the plasma cells will produce antibody, and the antibody will bind to the pathogen to mark and let the macrophage know that these pathogens must be destroyed by the form of phagocytosis. So the macrophage, they attack any pathogen that contains the antibody binding to it. So if you look at this picture right here, you can see that these right here represent antibodies, and you can see that these pathogens or bacteria are bound to these antibodies, and the macrophage will recognize that, which then will proceed on to what's known as phagocytosis. Okay? But before I do anything on this, I just want you to know in humoral immunity, it has indirect destruction of pathogens by antibodies, by the involvement of antibodies, or what's known as immunoglobulins. Let me just briefly talk about how the B lymphocytes are involved with the antibodies. So if people ask you this question, is it true that B lymphocytes produce the antibodies? And the answer is, it all depends on how you see it. But simplistically, people say yes, but to be more knowledgeable on this aspect, the answer is no. And here's what it means is that B lymphocytes so what we can say is upon exposure to pathogens, the B lymphocytes, or I'll use the word B cells, differentiate into 1 and 2. Okay. And I'm gonna move this up because I'm running out of space. I'm gonna move this up and I'm running out of space. So the B lymphocytes, so upon exposure to the pathogens, the B cells differentiate into, all right, 1 and 2. The first one's called plasma cells. Now these cells produce antibodies. And also they differentiate also into what's called memory cells. Now, when I asked the question, I said, what is the function of memory cells? And people say, well, duh, it remembers, okay? But that's not, that you can think of that, but what we can say is that memory cells has the ability to differentiate into plasma cells when the memory cells are exposed to the same pathogens as seen before. So what they always tell you is that if you have had the flu, or if you have had the flu in the past, within the past, there's a good chance that the flu symptoms that you have, even with the new flu virus, the symptoms are more mild. Okay, and the reason what happened is that you have been exposed to flu in the past, so we're talking within the short term. Um, and then for that reason, if you expose it to it again, the memory cells are present, which means they can quickly become the plasma cells, and the plasma cells begin to produce antibodies. So for that reason, the symptoms are more mild, which means that the the infectious agent has a shorter time to be able to survive because you begin to start making antibodies. So, which means that they don't have that much time to survive. And for that reason, the symptoms that or the symptoms that they inflict on you will be short life or short lived, I should say. So, which means that the effect will be more mild. So, in a nutshell, we can say is that the humoral immunity is indirect destruction of pathogens by the involvement of antibodies. So, the B lymphocytes, upon exposure to pathogens, the B lymphocytes differentiate into plasma cells, and the plasma cells begin to make antibodies, and the antibodies will bind to what's known as the bacteria, and the macrophage will begin to engulf any pathogen that is marked with the antibodies. All right, very good. Let's move on. Okay, so since we have talked about the immunity, the different type of immunity, let's talk about the lymphocytes involved. So the lymphocytes I want you to know that's involved are going to be T lymphocyte and B lymphocytes. So now, once again, we can talk about the T lymphocytes. So for the scope of this class, I'm going to mention two different types of T lymphocytes. The first one is called cytotoxic T cells. These type of T cells are involved with destruction of cancer and virus infected cells. So they are on the front line fighting off against virus and cancer cells. So they're very powerful in terms of their ability to fight off against these pathogens. Next thing is this, helper T cells. The helper T cells, they stimulate B cells. Now, if you remember what I said, is B cells are involved with antibodies. The helper T cells also regulate the action of cytotoxic T cells, And in addition to this, the helper T cells promote macrophage formation. So in essence, the helper T cells is not as so much being in the front line of defense. It's more in behind the scene in a sense. So it's more powerful because it stimulates B cells, and the more B cells you have, the more plasma cells you can make, which means you can make more antibodies. So that's very crucial. And now keep in mind this is that the antibody is used to mark or used to bind to bacteria, and which will promote the macrophage to engulf these bacteria and destroy these bacteria. And the helper T cells also promote the formation of the macrophage. So as you can see, with those two functions, the helper T cells are very, very powerful, but behind the scene type of deal. Now, in addition to this, the helper T cells also regulate the actions or the functions of cytotoxic T cells. And also meaning that it regulates the amount of cytotoxic T cells. So the more cytotoxic T cells you have, the more the more frontline defense you can have. So one thing is that let's talk about the HIV virus. So the HIV virus is very, very shrewd because why? It infects the helper T cells. So it actually infects the helper T cells, and the helper T cells has more functions involved as opposed to the cytotoxic T cells. And so if you infect the helper T cells, you indirectly impair the B cells, you indirectly impair the macrophage formation, and you indirectly impair the amount or the functions of cytotoxic T cells. So the HIV virus is very, very, very scary because why? It weakens our immune system. Now, when it weakens our immune system, any type of infection can cause us to succumb to any type of infection. So we succumb to it, which means we can die from the simple cold. So for that reason is that when you think of the lymphocytes, you want to think of the helper T cells and the cytotoxic T cells for the scope of my class. And so let's move on to the B lymphocytes. The B lymphocytes does not produce antibody, but what it does is that it it forms the B lymphocyte upon exposure to pathogens. The B cells differentiate into plasma cells, which make antibody, and memory cells, which has the ability to become plasma cells when they encounter, has the ability to become plasma cells when encountering the same pathogens. So the plasma cells produce these antibodies. So when you use the word IG stands for immunoglobulin, which represent antibody. Okay, so the IG is immunoglobulin, which represents antibody. Okay, now let's begin with the first one. Okay, so IgM. So when they measure the antibody, what happens is that they measure if there's an increase, if there's a spike in these antibodies. So what happens when you have an increase in IgM, IgG, IgA, and IgE? Okay, so what we can say is IgM, if there's a spike in it, that means you have recent infection. And the reason why it means recent infection is because IgM is the first type of antibody to be produced with new infection. Okay, so IgM is the first type of antibody to be produced with new infection. So if you have a spike in IgM, an increase in IgM, that just means that you have a new infection. Now, the IgG represent what's known as antibody. They always say this type of antibody is produced with recurrent infection. So what that means is that if you have recurrent infection, so you've seen this infection before and you beat infection in the past, but it's coming back, it's recurrent, that means you are going to produce IgG. Okay. Now, I also want to make a note of this. IgG could be passed on from the mother to her baby to offer protection in the first 6 months of life. So now, after the first 6 months, the baby, the infant, begin to produce his or her own IgM, IgG, and so on. Okay, but it is a form of survival in the sense that the mother protects the baby, her baby, in the first 6 months using her IgG. Okay. Now, IgA can be found in secretions, And when I say secretions, including mucus secretion. And milk. The secretions in general. So what that means is that, and milk, so we can say found in secretions, including milk, mucus secretion and milk, release onto a surface. So any surface that you have on the mucosa has what's called IgA. IgE is involved with allergy and parasitic infection. So when there's a spike in IgE, it indicates that you have allergy or you could have parasitic infection. Now, there's a good chance of this is it's allergy season and you have never left the US and you have you managed to practice, hygienic practice in caring for the food. So there's a good chance that you cook all your food, and there's a good chance that you don't have parasites. There's a very good chance that you have no parasites. So which means the IgE spike or increase is indicative of allergy. So the rise in the antibody or immunoglobulin is used in diagnosis as well. All right, very good. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is going to show you the difference between immune responses. So on the left side, it says primary immune response, and the right side shows secondary immune response curve. I want you to look at those two graphs, and see the difference between the two graphs. And I will wait, and I will wait for 2 minutes and for you to tell me the distinction between the two graphs. Now, when you read a graph, you want to read the axes. This is the y-axis. And this represents the x-axis. As you can see, the y-axis represents the concentration of antibody in the plasma. The x-axis represents the time after exposure to the antigen, or we can say pathogen, antigen of the pathogens. So look at the graph, and I'm gonna pause this and I'm gonna wait until you tell me what the difference or the distinction between the two graphs, or tell me something, the differences between the two graphs that you see. The left side represents the primary immune response. The right side represents secondary immune response. Okay, so let's continue on. I know you guys wrote down the answers. Let's continue on this. So look at the graph that you see here. In the primary immune response, there's a few things. So let's talk about what we see first. You see a curve that goes up and down. This curve represents what's called antibody concentration in the primary immune response. And the same goes for in the secondary immune response, there is also an antibody concentration curve as well. But the two curves has different size. So let's talk about what happened first with this. Now, if you notice in the first immune response, primary immune response, there is a period in which there's no antibody present. That period. And so what we can say is that period is going to be called, there is a lag period. So the lag period is going to be defined as a period in which antibody is not present in the plasma despite of being exposed to the pathogen. Now, what that means is this. So what does it mean? What exactly is a lag period? What is involved? That's the question that you want to ask, is that what is involved in this lag period? Um, so the lag period, so I'm going to type in the lag period down here. So I'm going to put a small lag period. I'll make it very small. So I can't do much on this. Okay. And you can see in this case is that there's a lag period right here. I'll change the color, make it distinctive. All right. Now the lag period is absent, so there's no lag period. There's no lag period in the secondary immune response. Okay, so you probably ask why. Okay. So what actually occurs during the lag period? That's the question we want to ask, is that what occurs during the lag period? And what happened during the lag period is, so let's talk about the lag period. So what happened during the lag period is going to be you have so during the lag period you have the B cell differentiation into the plasma cells and memory cells. Also during the lag period you have what's known as the plasma cells begin to produce antibody. So you can see it takes time for it to rise. So it takes about anywhere between 5 days, about 5 days, more or less. You can approximately say 5 days. So if you want to say 4, that's fine. So you can see this, it's about 5 days. So number one represent on the, so in the graph, the first graph on the left, number one represent week, the first week. So when you look at where there's a rise, there's a gradual rise in the antibody. That is about day 5 or day 4. It doesn't really matter. But the plasma cells begin to produce antibody, and it takes time to produce antibody. So it takes time. So for that reason, so during this lag period, there's no antibody present despite the fact of being exposed to pathogen. So when you're first exposed to any infectious agent, the symptoms are more, major. It's not mild, okay? So it's a bit more severe in a sense. Now, once you have secondary immune response, so secondary immune response is that what it means is the immune response against recurrent infection. That means you are fighting off against the same infection. Okay. So there's no lag period. Okay. So there's no lag period. So what it means is this. So what it means is that. So there's no lag period, and what that means is upon exposure to the same pathogen, the memory cells differentiate into plasma cells, and antibody can produce can quickly be produced. For that reason, you can see there's a spike in the antibody is produced right away as the antigen or the pathogen is exposed. So and then you can actually see the amount of antibody being produced very, very quick. And for that reason, there's a high amount of antibody. And the symptoms will be very mild because you are up and going against the pathogen. So the pathogen does not live long enough to cause harm to you. And for that reason, they use the word mild symptoms. So hopefully this gives you a very good understanding of the lymphatic system and the immune system. Okay, and keep in mind this, the immune system is a subset of the lymphatic system. So take notes, write down your notes, and form questions and ask me questions during the Q&A session.